Welcome to Haven't Heard with me, Adrian. This is the story of my journey to musical enlightenment. There's a little bit of sound quality issues in places, just because it is over the phone, so just bear with it. It's still a good conversation. Alright, so we're listening to Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath?
Yes. Yep, self-titled album.
And that was released on, looks like, February 13th, 1970.
Yep. Friday the 13th, also.
That was the European release, though, correct?
Definitely in Europe. I can't say 100% that was the date for the US, but I thought it was also.
This is all really well researched, as you can tell, so. I cannot find it. So we'll say it was around the same time.
Yeah.
Now, I actually had difficulty when finding this to listen to because there are a million different versions of it floating around.
It was, when it was released, like the US and Europe got slightly different versions. And it could be the case for other countries. I don't know so much about the initial release, but,
right.
There were a couple of different versions. Some don't include the cover that they did, Evil Woman, and some do. But, I mean, whether you have either version, though, I think it's only the difference in that song, really.
Yeah, it looks like, they had Evil Woman on the European edition and Wicked World on the North American edition.
Ah, so that's what it was.
So I listened to the European edition because I figured that was more of the OG edition.
There you go.
So I got that cover. When did you first hear the album?
It's really, that's a tough thing to pin down. Like the moment that, I first heard it, in its entirety. But basically, like, it kind of more or less came out of, just discovering the band and then kind of going from there. Mostly I think it came about through friends. At the time, I was living way out in the woods, pre-internet. So I didn't really have a good concept of like what was out there musically. So obviously, people that I knew that knew about it. So it was kind of like old fashioned, you just pass things down the line, but then also like radio. And so like I'd hear it on the radio and I'd record what I could on a cassette tape, but not knowing what albums they were from and whatnot. So that's kind of like my first foray into Black Sabbath. So for me, it's like kind of hard to know 100% when I heard this album in its entirety, but initially my like Black Sabbath collection was just cassette tapes from whatever I could gather. So it was like this hodgepodge of most of the classic albums.
All right. I'm sure you had difficulty pinning down the names of the songs that you bootlegged, just as I had trouble pinning down the names of the songs I was listening to going between versions.
Yeah, exactly. I don't even remember. I think in those days, I'd just take a stab at what the song was called, unless like the radio jockey made it clear, somebody actually had something I could copy that had it listed out. But
right.
And then later on, obviously, I figured out the more in-depth history, like, of the band and what albums were, and I started, getting them in their entirety. But yeah, it started with just like word of mouth, I guess, on the radio and making my own recordings with the band, and then slowly learning the history over time and then slowly realizing the initial impact of this actual album, considering it came out early 1970. And if you kind of think about the contrasting music that was popular in those days.
Right, yeah, it sounds like they were, with a couple other bands, they were kind of paving the way for what would become more heavy metal.
Mm-hmm. I kind of feel like this album was was the definitive point of origin, and for all the influential subgenres there are of the whole metal world. But I think like it's this album that really like makes it a direct pipeline to kind of metal as we know it nowadays. There were certainly predecessors, and there were certainly people immediately thereafter that you could pull certain influences from, but I don't know if like you really give all them a ton of credit as much as you can Black Sabbath, just because I mean you like hear it in the first track, like the tritones and just the general heaviness of it and darkness and scariness of it. Like other bands were just kind of like heavy blues, or just playing really loud, because mid 60s and up through there, amp technology had improved drastically. So people like Hendrix and The Who and the multitude of other 60s bands, they could play loud, be rocking, and that was all they had to do. But it never really had like any kind of dark incantation. And then like Black Sabbath comes along and, it's dark and scary.
Right. Yeah. That, just in the first 30 seconds of, that self-titled song, it's, pretty evil.
Yeah. I mean, and especially if you kind of like yourself in the mindset of somebody living at the time, like, probably the scariest thing was, I don't even know. I don't even know what you would call scary. Like people weren't making scary music. There was some kind of like occult rock bands in those days, but even they sounded like, prog rock hippie bands. Like maybe the content was dark and evil. It's
right, but the music didn't match.
Right. So to me, it wasn't until the guys came along and like made an effort to make their music sound heavy and scary that metal really came together.
What else were you listening to at the time then that you first heard Black Sabbath?
That's a good question. Probably whatever I could get my hands on. It wasn't until like the early 90s when I was like 11, 12, 13 that I took a more pointed interest in like discovering things that I liked as far as music, versus before it was just like you just listened to what your parents had, right? And in those days, all my parents listened to was what they bought in the 70s. So like Aerosmith and Neil Diamond and Eagles, I'm probably could name a ton of others. But before that, that's what all I would listen to, because that's all my parents had. But then you make different friends, their parents listen to different music, and lo and behold, you find something that your parents didn't listen to, and you're like, well, where the hell was this? But at the time, I was probably listening to, didn't have too many albums that I called my own. Definitely Guns N' Roses around this time. That was also probably one of the earlier heavy bands that like kind of really struck a chord with me. And then Black Sabbath, for whatever reason, I think just because of their general heaviness, and then I think it became more apparent how cool they were when when they started, because when I first heard them, you could kind of hear the age in the recording quality, but you didn't know how old that was. It didn't seem particularly dated to me. I definitely would sit down and learn a lot of Black Sabbath songs because, and that's kind of how I learned like certain styles of his playing in my own playing. I'd just sit there for hours and just sit there and play Black Sabbath, because it was actually pretty approachable as an early guitar player, in my opinion.
Right, yeah, the guitar work is actually fairly simple sounding, but is actually kind of a pretty unique playing style, right?
Absolutely. And yeah, we could talk for hours about Iommi's playing style, but and that mostly came about his injuries to his hand.
Right, yeah. I'd heard that he had an injury to some of his fingertips.
He was working at I think it was like 17 or 18 or something like that. It was like his last day working at this metalworks factory, something like that. And so it's like his last day, and they put him on like a metal sheet cutting machine. So you just feed the metal in, and this comes down, cuts the metal, right? And so he wasn't paying attention, and it cut the tips off like not his pinky or his thumb, but the other 3 fingers, your ring finger, index finger, just chop the tops of them all off. So he, when he was at the hospital while they were taking care of that, like the foreman at the plant or whatever came and visited him, and I guess played. Do you know who Django Reinhardt is?
Not explicitly.
Yeah, he's kind of definitely old school. I think even for, I don't know, whatever year that was, 1967 or 8. But the guy had, I don't know if he had an injured hand or he was just born crippled. But anyway, the guy can play guitar with 2 fingers, and he does it quite well. And so he just played this, the foreman just played it for him, and he was like, yeah, that's great, because he was pretty despondent. He didn't think he was going to be able to play anymore. And then he told him that guy he just heard only had 2 fingers. So he was like, oh, shit, I guess I can do this. So he made prosthetics by melting down plastic bottles initially, and then got light gauge strings, which actually didn't exist at the time. So he was using banjo strings on his guitar, so that he could bend the strings easier, because he couldn't feel them with his little prosthetics that he made. And that also limited chords he could play, that kind of thing. So he tended to focus on just playing straight, the root and the fifth, which was pretty predominant in metal in general. Like, people don't tend to get terribly creative when it comes to their chording, especially when you're just playing straight chords. So, and it just naturally kind of has a heavier tone, especially when you're going for that heavy sound. And I think, like, if you listen to some of his interviews, like, I get the impression that he wasn't necessarily trying to make it sound heavy as we define it these days. More like he was looking for a way to make his guitar sound bigger, right? So, right. Which just kind of ended up making it sound heavy in the context of how we expect heavy metal to sound. So it was kind of like an incidental thing. And then you have Geezer who played bass. So he was a guitar player. He didn't play bass until they started this band. Instead of doing kind of what you would hear, at least at the time, with bass players, kind of in the back, just laying the groove down or playing things that the guitar player wasn't, like, at least note for note. But being a guitar player, he would just play exactly what Tony was playing, at least as far as the riff. So that just ended up reinforcing heavy sound, especially when it came to the riff, because he'd just play the same thing. So, you add all those things up and they just kind of ended up sounding heavy.
Right. And that's probably one of the biggest things that I hear in metal now is the bass doubles the guitars, I'd say almost exclusively, which adds that heavy, thick sound, but sometimes it makes the bass player a little forgettable.
I think in metal, just in general, only really certain bands, or at least certain genres, it's the bass player can be critical or not. Definitely, if you just kind of look at more just straightforward, like thrash, or even, the new metal genres, right? The bass players they're just doing exactly what the guitar players are doing. So yeah, they kind of get forgotten. But it depends on the band. It depends on what they're playing. Some bass players kind of find some sort of pocket sometimes, or the songs are written a little better where there's room for all the instruments. It just depends. But yeah, in general, and that's kind of where that started initially, was Geezer just playing exactly what Tony was playing.
Right, because it sounded heavy. There was quite a bit of a lot of groovy bass, actually, that I was jotting down as I was listening to the album.
Yeah, and that's a funny thing too. The whole album, really, like, for me, like, song Black Sabbath and then NIB are, like, really the quintessential metal songs from the album. And then if you look at the other songs, they had heaviness, but they're also, like, still heavily rooted in the kind of, like, heavy blues rock.
Right. I heard a lot of that.
Yeah. And it wasn't really until 4 months later when they recorded their next album. So which is also funny because they released 2 albums in 1970. only 4 months apart.
But they recorded this one in one day, though, right? For the most part.
They did, 12 hours. They just played live. Like Ozzy was just in a booth while they played live, and that's how they recorded this whole album.
It sounds way better than that.
Yeah, it sounds better than, yeah, you're right. They did a very tiny amount of overdubs, but the brunt of that album is recorded live. I don't know, if you kind of like put that in perspective, like they just put in 12 hours that day, and then like without really knowing, it kind of defined a whole genre of music, and thousands of bands are influenced by it, and everything they did thereafter for the most part. It's pretty awesome, and that doesn't happen anymore.
They probably just went in, slammed it out, hit the pub, and didn't even think twice about it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened.
Like, they probably just like, oh, cool, we recorded an album. That's fun. Let's go get drunk.
Yep, I think that's pretty much exactly what happened right there. They had recorded before that. They had released like a single, which that and a few shows helped them get a little attention. And then this record company gave them like, okay, we'll give you 2 days. And so they did it, and it actually did really well. I think it charted really good. I think it charted in the top 10 in England, and then I think it was much lower in the US, obviously, but it still was on, it's charted at least. And it did well commercially, despite really bad reviews, but
yeah, I read some of those reviews. They were
that's gonna happen because it's like,
I mean, it's not what's
the
popular.
way this album's, it wasn't what's popular, and it was completely different than anything anybody had heard, especially early 1970s. Everything was very, very poppy, very happy, that like actually did well and was always like critically acclaimed. And this was like the opposite of that.
Right. Now, it definitely, as I was listening to it, I could not hear the age other than, some of that recording quality. But the actual music itself did not sound, over 40 years old.
Yeah, it's so old. It's pretty remarkable.
Now, you said that Black Sabbath and NIB are the two for you that kind of stand out as like metal.
Mm-hmm.
Like that metal sound. I definitely agree with you on NIB. That was my favorite one. It had kind of that, almost that classic sound with a little bit of the major to minor kind of feel in the choruses, and a little bit of that like the guitar jamming bits. Yep.
No, that song like has a really good progression, and then just that main like, I don't, what is it, like 4 chords, just that it's something you can kind of bang your head to. Like, they still play it live, even though they're on their last tour ever. They still play it. It's always been part of their live, and it's just something they recorded one day in a session of 12 hours, and it's like they've been playing it for a lifetime, and people are always down to it.
Yeah, and it started kind of weird. I guess does it start with that kind of wah bass solo bit, or is that coming out of the previous song? Because since it was on vinyl, it's really hard to pin down, song transitions.
Yeah, especially the way that I don't know what that's a product of. It could have been like, one, they just, they came in and just kind of recorded the whole thing live, and 2, it was released on vinyl. So it's like, if you kind of look at the track listings, they kind of lump like four of the songs in like one chunk. But yeah, he kind of like breaks off into that bass wah, which he still plays before they play it live now. He just does that little jam, and then he kicks into the riff, and then it goes.
All right, so it is part of the song then, because I was listening.
It's definitely part of the song, yeah.
I was listening to that.
It's hard to tell.
That fade out on like the solo drums from Behind the Wall of Sleep before that, and then it kind of fades out, and then this just random wah bass solo comes in, and then it just kind of jumps into the actual driving riff of the song, and I was like, did I miss a time cue or?
Yeah, I mean, no, I guess they intended it to be part of the song, or maybe they didn't at the time, and they just started doing it live. I'm not 100% sure, but as far as I know, yeah, it's part of the song.
Yeah, and the best stuff is bullshit that people come up with on the spot. So
yeah, and that's what's kind of cool about that album. It's like they did it in a way that like most people can't anymore. It's just like this moment in time. These four guys came together and it just happened in the most organic way possible.
Oh yeah, that's
and was hugely successful.
That the idea of going in and recording 7 songs in 12 hours. I've done recording sessions where we barely got 5 songs of just drum tracking done in a full day.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely an album that you can say was well recorded, given the circumstances. And I guess it also helped. They were actually well rehearsed. Tony Iommi, he did a brief stunt with Jethro Tull.
Okay.
So originally, when these guys got together, they came out of 2 different bands and then formed one band, and they were called it. I think first they called it Polka Telk Blues Band, and then they called it Earth, and then Tony Iommi quit to go play with Jethro Tull, and then decided Jethro Tull wasn't for him, and came back. And I think this is like 68 or something like that. And then they ended up having to change the name. There was another Earth. But what he learned from Jethro Tull's more professional experience is that they needed to do this every day. So he was the only one with a car. So he would go pick everybody up at like 9 a.m, and they'd rehearse every day, like all day.
Well, definitely you can hear it.
So by the time they got to record this album, they had already had decent shows under their belt. They'd been practicing every day, which was more common with like people that wanted to be a full-time musician in those days. So by the time it came time to record the album, they had the right guy behind the board and the right band laying down, and it just happened.
Yeah, and I mean they did that the little bit of overdubbing. Now I heard 2 things I think were overdubbed. There was that harmonica on The Wizard.
Yeah, that's probably overdubbed. You couldn't have that in the room.
Right, and that's definitely not something I was expecting to hear on the basically quintessential metal album.
Yeah, and that's kind of like goes back to my point where like some of this album has those elements of what really influenced the whole heavy music genre, at least when it comes to like bands, but then it still is kind of rooted in their earlier roots with music, and a lot of British musicians playing American blues. So yeah, Ozzy's in there with the harmonica,
right,
over one of the songs, and it's really cool and not something you'd expect for sure.
Yeah, I can hear that kind of that back and forth they do in, I'd say, most of the music, where they kind of, I feel that push and pull between them, like knowing they want to be like doing something heavier, and them going off their previous more blues rock experience.
Yep.
Just because it some of the riffs kind of, they're really just rock and roll sounding, and then it explodes into like a straight up metal riff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in their first album, they're still kind of defining their sound, but like if you listen to the subsequent albums after this, it really just landslides to the one direction.
Right, and do they continue doing a lot of that tom rolling? Because there's a lot of the drum parts where there's just a lot of tom rolling going on, and it kind of felt like that was a little bit of a a leftover
yeah.
from kind of that other music influence.
Yeah, well, you'll see that with like, I don't know, like is a good example, like Keith Moon, like just really extended displays of drum rolls and fills and everything like that. It's possible Bill Ward had that influence, but he just had a unique style of playing in general. If you really listen to him, how he keeps a beat, it's pretty odd, and he doesn't play like 100% on time. It's like this really loose vibe. I know it.
Right, and that feels that kind of, loose timing feels really jazzy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good word for it.
Definitely, that's a heavy jazz influence kind of approach.
I don't know much about Bill Ward's early years or like where he learned drum, but it's given what year that was, it's a good assumption to say like most drummers in those days were learning, like if they took lessons, or at least were learning from other drummers. I think you just kind of like have jazz and blues as part of your early repertoire, versus nowadays, obviously, because there's a million places to draw influence from on percussion. But in those days, it was limited.
Some of those people that came, before them, some of those beasts on the drum kit were jazz musicians.
At least starting out, for sure. But yeah, the Ward style always really stood out to me. Like I can't think of any other band where you hear somebody that plays drums like that.
Well, my music experience
very unique fills
is clearly limited, so I can't really say.
Hey, well, after listening to this album, now you got a little more knowledge.
I mean, it sounds like you definitely still listen to it.
Yeah, I do. It's like those, it's like when you're growing up and like, I think music holds more of a power over you, and those early songs and music that you discover that you enjoy end up really kind of getting stuck in your brain and defining you in a certain way. So, I mean, as you get older, I feel that fades to a degree, but people always go back and listen to the music of their early years, and it always makes you feel good because it made you feel good when you first heard it.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Anytime I want to go remember what it was like not giving a shit and playing with Legos, I just pop on some Tom Petty.
Sure,
it just takes me right back.
Yeah, I mean, like even these days, like I was saying in my earlier days, like before I was like really finding my own music, it's like I don't really mind listening to Fleetwood Mac, Neil Diamond, even the Eagles. Like it just, to me, it's just kind of nostalgic. It doesn't bother me at all because I just grew up listening to it. But the same holds true for Black Sabbath. When I first started getting into them, that's what part got me excited about playing guitar, and when I kind of really understood the true impact of their time, it just kind of made it even that more exciting for me.
I mean, does that album or just Black Sabbath's music in general, does that still influence how you play or write music?
Probably less now. I think at some point you end up kind of, finding your own way. But, you got to give credit where credit's due. Definitely early on. Like, I would directly attribute their existence to me finding, a home, at least musically, and playing loud, playing, riffs, and that kind of just being it. That's kind of what defines heavy metal. It's just something about playing really loud with your friends and just making really heavy, scary music. It's just, I don't know. It influenced me directly. Absolutely. Coming of age 20 years after the fact, at least in my own right as a musician, I had plenty of other influences too at the time, because metal had obviously progressed much further after their popularity demise.
Right. I mean, and if they're the first, or if we're saying that they're the first, then obviously there's going to be a ton of other people that jump into popularity after them and kind of replace them almost as the as time goes on.
Yeah, they did. They certainly did. The 70s were just this would it be a cool decade to go back to go from Elvis and the Beatles and Rolling Stones and the Who, and then the 70s come along and all the multitude of pop hippie music and Hendrix and Santana and all that crap, and then 1970 hits and these guys from Birmingham make this dark album, and then a few other bands kind of from that same vein also start playing, and then it wasn't really more than a few years after that bands just kind of started changing, and most of them will tell you indirectly influence of this album and this band, but if you look at the progression of rock through the 70s, it's fast. It was 2 years after that, it was Deep Purple, and then Led Zeppelin was around at the same time, but they were more of they weren't the band that kind of put it on the dark side. They were always kind of that mystical rock band, even though they were grandiose in their presence. They did it really well, what they did, but they were far more listenable. I guess they had a greater span of an audience that they could play to versus Black Sabbath. It was kind of this very specific thing.
Right.
These type of people that really identified with it. And
also the lyrics kind of sound like they would alienate a lot of people.
Yeah, they can, which is kind of funny. If you actually look at Black Sabbath lyrics, I think, and I'm not, it's just sometimes people, especially in the past when people were reviewing the album, but God, which song is it on this album? I'm drawing a blank, but it's basically a song about, the devil falling in love with a girl, and then that makes him a better person.
Right, and that's NIB. It seemed like.
Yes, sorry, that was the one.
That very metal song is the one that's clearly about a devil.
Yep, and then even if you look at the scariest song on the album, so the song that really blew people away was the Black Sabbath song. It's just about it's a story with that scary music behind it. Is people make assumptions. So, and there were a few other things around the release of the album that kind of made them not as a direct action on their part, but just lumped in with Satanists and occultists, and so it's just they didn't even do it on purpose. But this mystique just kind of followed it, and I think that's where that brand of music and that association with the devil and the occult intertwined and just kind of really blossomed from there. I mean, you look at 40 years of heavy metal, and it's it's hand in hand.
Right. So metal came into existence already being associated with the devil.
Yep. Even the band, even though the band wasn't terribly directly involved with that association, because in those days, so when they released this album, they gave them 2 days, right? So It was just the album kind of be okay, we record you, we release the album. So they did the album cover, which you got to give them credit for. They actually didn't fuck this one up, because that album cover actually fits the album perfectly. But unbeknownst to them, on the European release, the inner part of the album, when you opened up the vinyl, had this poem on the sleeve with an inverted cross.
Oh.
The band didn't put that in, the label did, and so that just added to the controversy. And then, I don't know how true this is, but when they released it in the US, I guess the release party, Anton LaVey was also in attendance. And so then you have, the guy, the head of the Church of Satan, into Black Sabbath, or at least the rumor is that he was present when it was released, the release party in the US. So all these things that, the association just stuck.
Right, and you can count on the U.S. to, escalate the controversy a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in the U.S.
Yep. We have to do it bigger. Well, it sounds like the label knew what they were doing then, putting that in.
Yeah, much to their credit. I mean, at least in foresight, I think they did a lot of people a service by marketing the band as such. It always just kind of blew me away that here all of a sudden is something that's like never been heard or done. And it wasn't until they took it over the edge there that other bands were like, oh, wow, that's really cool. I had no idea I could do that.
Right. It kind of gave everyone else permission to just kind of go dark.
Exactly. Yeah. And like I said, if you look at the history of heavy rock bands and metal throughout the 70s, it's just like all of a sudden it was everywhere. And you ask 95% of them what their main influence was, it's going to be Black Sabbath every time.
I definitely hear that a lot. It's kind of Black Sabbath and the Beatles have to be your influence, otherwise people start freaking out on you.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the Beatles were much of an influence on me. I did learn a few of their songs early on, but that was always boring on guitar because the way they wrote their music wasn't just like the guitar was more in service to the song versus like its own entity.
Right. They were much more arrangement.
Yep. I think if anything you can give Beatles credit for is like their singing, because that had its own voice. Like everything else kind of just served the melodies of the vocals.
Right, and that's been Beatles Talk with Dan.
At least in my opinion.
So would you say then that Black Sabbath is the Beatles of metal? Yes or no?
Yes. Yep, that is a correct assumption.
Great.
But much better than the Beatles.
I would also agree, but that's a conversation for a different day.
Totally. But I am not your Beatles guy. You'll have to find somebody else.
I do not anticipate doing the Beatles at all, so I've heard all I needed to hear.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any final thoughts about Black Sabbath, metal, or the album?
Other than I think like anybody that remotely enjoys heavy music, whether it's, balls out metal like Slayer, The Extreme, even as far as, black metal goes, like you gotta check out Black Sabbath. Like if you listen to metal now and don't know anything about it, you have to listen to where it came from. It's interesting too, because if you look at a lot of doom bands now, like kind of the doom metal genre, every single one of them still like worships Sabbath. Like you can look, in fact, a new band I started listening to called Castle. I think their newest album looks very similar to this album cover, at least that the fact that they took the same font that the Black Sabbath's written on the cover for their band Castle. So just like you still see it, like new bands still are like in tribute to Black Sabbath 4 years later.
It's not even necessarily like a basis of the culture, it just is the culture.
Yeah, it's actually a very good point, is that there's almost the culture around just like recognizing and paying tribute to Black Sabbath, or just, it's like this unifying force in all metalheads. It's like everybody you run into that's a fan of metal is like knows every Black Sabbath song, or at least pays tribute to him in some way. It's kind of an interesting thing, but there's a culture in of its own of just the Black Sabbath culture, whether it's, whatever that entails, whether it's the visual aspect or the direct influence to their playing, but it's still a thing that perpetuates for sure.
That's why we're here, because I love heavy music and never heard a Black Sabbath album front to back. So
yeah, now you have to go and listen to the rest of them.
See, and this is what I'm afraid of doing this whole project too, is that every single band I get introduced to, I'm now going to have to go through their entire back catalog, and I'm going to have a lot of my time eaten up.
Hey, you can do it. There's worse things than having to listen to music you haven't heard before.
Oh, there's a lot worse things.
And there's only so many Black Sabbath songs really worth listening to. Like once you get to Technical Ecstasy, you can just turn it off. Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy are kind of the low points of the classic lineup. So yeah, I wouldn't listen to those, but everything before that, like, listen to them.
Well, like all monoliths among entertainment, they had to decline at some point, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, the very people that they influenced ended up being the competition in the end. It took 20 years for them to then be recognized as like a piece of nostalgia for them to be successful again.
Right, because that's when they say, hey, we should play together again.
Yeah, and then like all these people who've been discovering their albums for the last 20 years while they haven't been in a band is like, oh, well, I'll never get to see them live. And all of a sudden they got back together and did several tours in 98 and through the thousands. And then they did this, now they're on their like the end tour, which is almost done, but they won't tour again after that.
That's understandable. They're getting up there.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing though, like the way that progressed, like the very people that by the late 70s had overtaken them in popularity and skill. They had taken the very music that they created to the next level, and then they were then obsolete. And it took 20 years for them to be recognized as a piece of heavy metal nostalgia. So when they got back together, it was huge. If they had done that, I think if they had done that any sooner, it wouldn't have been as successful. You could almost look at it as a blessing that they kind of did drop off the map for 20 years, at least as far as like being an active band. I don't think anybody ever stopped listening to them.
Because if they had stayed around during that time, they might have had a lot of opportunity to fuck it up.
Yep, I don't think it could have gone any other way.
All right, Dan, well, thank you for talking to me about Black Sabbath and setting me on the path to greatness.
Absolutely, no problem, man.